Hey everyone, Anarch here. Do you ever get this feeling like there's nothing we can do? That the task at hand is just too enormous for us to confront? Or maybe that the project is just too far gone to ever salvage what's been lost? If so, you can't be blamed. After all, the forces arrayed against human liberation appear innumerable. But I've made this video today to tell you it's not too late. The world is not unsalvageable, and the opponents to human liberation are not insurmountable. There are real, material paths towards self-determination and dignity that exist for our species, if only we choose to seize them. To achieve these changes, we must take an analytical approach to the systems we are embedded inside of, and construct the proper response with attention and urgency. There is a great deal of time devoted in our communities toward deconstructing the capitalist paradigm, toward decomposing oppressive belief systems, and toward uncovering Gödelian contradictions wherever they may lie. But while this process of deconstruction and its critical insights are valuable, it has a tendency to focus our minds upon critique rather than action. This is not to say that deconstruction is not important. It is. It is instead to say that if we wish to build a better society, we must also know what it is we're trying to build and how we will build it, not just why the current one has failed us. If we don't manage these dual needs, we risk two very dire outcomes. One, a citizenry that is educated on the flaws of capitalism, but is sent into a spiral of distress because of the lack of an apparent alternative, defeatism. Or two, a citizenry that is motivated out of anger, but is not prepared to build the better world to replace it, aimlessness. Either defeatism or aimlessness are undesirable if we wish to actually achieve a revolutionary outcome. And I do not think this can be solved through further deconstruction. Thus, what we will seek to do in this video is construct. After all, if an arrow is to hit its mark, the archer must know both how to wield their bow and where they desire for the arrow to land. Today, what I want to do is discuss change and revolution. Murray Bookchin once said, in his work Ecology and Revolutionary Thought, that in each era following the Renaissance, revolutionary ideology has been crucially informed by an emerging school of scientific thought whose novel analysis was brought to bear on society. He summarized the eras in the following way. Astronomy in the time of Copernicus and Galileo helped to guide a sweeping movement of ideas from the medieval world, riddled by superstition, into one pervaded by a critical rationalism, openly naturalistic and humanistic in outlook. During the Enlightenment, the era that culminated in the Great French Revolution, this liberatory movement of ideas was reinforced by advances in mechanics and mathematics. The Victorian era was shaken to its very foundations by evolutionary theories in biology and anthropology, by Marx's reworking of Ricardian economics, and, toward its end, by Freudian psychology. For our era, Bookchin says, it is the science of ecology which will drive the development of a more complete and enduring revolutionary ideology. The ideal society this would produce, post-scarcity anarchism as he calls it, would utilize a new conception of ecology and its organization called social ecology, which includes all human social structures within the purview of the ecological perspective, bringing the synthetic into harmony with the organic. In the spirit, although maybe not the exact letter of Bookchin's observation, we will borrow from another discipline in science called complex systems analysis. This discipline concerns itself with the analysis of systems which are composed of delicately interconnected pieces, which, when combined together, produce nonlinear behaviors. These complex systems occur all throughout nature, both in the realm of the synthetic, such as in computers and economies, and in the realm of the organic, such as in biologies and ecologies. And in these systems, many interesting behaviors arise, but there are two in particular that we want to utilize in this video: feedback cycles and emergence. Let us inspect the first. A feedback cycle arises when the result of some process becomes the new starting point for that process as it cycles again. A feedback cycle thus feeds back into itself. Such processes are quite dynamic and responsive, prone to large changes when small alterations are made to their material conditions. In general, they can assume three main behaviors. In a negative feedback cycle, the result of each cycle is less than what the cycle began with, meaning that the process slowly diminishes in strength with each completion. In a positive feedback cycle, the result of each cycle is larger than what it began with, meaning that the system's strength grows with each cycle, enforcing the process upon each completion. In a stable feedback cycle, the input and the output are in harmony, unlikely to either diminish to non-existence nor to explode to excess. In the synthetic fields, especially computer science, these cycles are the ones they attempt to engineer. In organic fields, such as ecology, these are the processes which tend to be created when natural systems reach equilibrium through gradual self-adjustment. In order to see how this concept can inform our theory of action, let us consider a test system. In this system, we have modeled one among many possible feedback cycles: the feedback between top-down and bottom-up effects in electoral politics. For those who are only listening, we'll parse out the cycle in a pseudo-linear fashion. Organizing creates pressure on power structures. This pressure extracts concessions. Concessions amplify the organizers. Organizers then take this energy to put more pressure on power structures, and so on. Now, historically, there has been some contention among different left tendencies as to how the cycle of progress should be understood. While many anarchists have contended that all important effects should be thought of as originating from the organized masses, many historical Marxists have contended that the alteration of material conditions must be reinforced from the top. But given that both of these claims are linear in nature, they both fall flat within this framework. Instead, this view sees each distinct effort as a contributing component which either accelerates or decelerates the various cycles that are involved in the mechanisms of political change. In other words, at each juncture of a feedback cycle, energy either builds or diminishes cyclically within that particular system. Each step of the process feeds back into the cycle, producing a new outcome. So let us use our organizing cycle from a moment ago. If, for example, a movement is unable to extract meaningful concessions, this will have a tendency to create organizer burnout, which will then weaken the group as it turns back to attempt to extract more concessions. This is what led to the slow dissolution of the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. Because they did not achieve significant concessions, their amplification slowly diminished, burning out the organizers. If at each juncture energy builds, however, a movement will enter a positive feedback cycle where concessions will be gained more and more rapidly over time. Take, as a modern example, how the arrival of Bernie Sanders onto the public scene affected the rest of politics in 2016. By the simple fact that he used the self-descriptor of democratic socialist, we have seen the radicalization of an enormous number of people in the United States, resulting in a resurgence of the DSA and other leftist organizations, both domestically and abroad. This energy and increased membership was then marshaled toward the election of other socialists, such as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the expansion of other leftist projects, in a more general sense. We can think of this as a positive cycle. But we must not be reductive on either account stated above. Indeed, the two events can be said to be highly correlated, such that Occupy Wall Street, even though it dissolved before achieving its demands, set the stage for the emergence of a Bernie Sanders-like figure by planting seeds of mass dissent in the populace. In this more holistic view, we might say the two events were therefore linked through a much, much larger but slow-growing feedback cycle that was in construction from roughly 2011 to 2016, interacting with the Marxian aspects of alienation and capitalist self-sabotage. In this view, each organization is an internal feedback with itself and an external feedback with all other components of society. The individual, in constant interaction with the other aspects of the world, represents the smallest political feedback cycle, all of whom are summed together to play out the dynamics of the total system. This makes political change into an analysis of delicately nested and interconnected cycles, combining the operational needs and actions of both the individual and various collectives. The key to enforcing this particular aspect of our theory of change is to understand that at each of the junctures where a movement can gain or lose energy, it has to create a mechanism to maintain or capitalize on its successes, both at the institutional level and the level of the individual. If a mass organization fails to capitalize on their successes to maintain their numbers, or to exact their pressure successfully after achieving consensus, they'll find that their power dwindles progressively as time goes on. This may sound exhausting in the never-ending effort that is required to animate the engine of change, but sustained and meaningful progress does require perpetual vigilance. There is some good news, however, rooting from the other phenomena we mentioned earlier. Emergence is a phenomenon that occurs when properties that are not strictly contained in a system's basic rule set arise organically from some combination of those rules once they are in play. But don't think that this means the emergent properties are any less real than the systems they arise from. Thermodynamics, for example, is not a set of rules that is found written in the stone codex of reality. It is what arises from a rigorous statistical analysis of particle systems. Yet, the naturalists of the 1800s discovered thermodynamics well before they ever understood particle physics. This process of emergence takes place in almost every occasion due to the limits of the system in question, and how those ensuing constraints affect the behavior of the things inside. In the case of quantum mechanics, for example, boundary conditions determine how particles inside the system evolve over time. In the case of ecologies, it can be found that limitations on resources, geographical separations, natural excesses, and disasters can all come to define the behaviors of the creatures within their purview. In our case, we are arguing that the rule sets and unspoken assumptions of power structures create emergent behaviors in the people who populate those structures and their subjects. I spoke about this property of emergence by a different name in my previous video, The Case Against Hierarchy, in the reference to Conway's Law, and in my video about human nature when speaking about humanity's fundamental adaptability. If a hierarchical structure is created, those that are within it will assume hierarchical behavior. If a structure predicated upon individual merit is created, a cycle of competition will arise. And so too will a structure of solidarity therefore engender a cycle of cooperation. This is also what motivates the principle of prefiguration in several anarchist movements. The IWW, for example, has modeled a recognition of emergence in their famous advice to build the new in the shell of the old. The Zapatistas also seemed to motion toward this concept in their most recent communique, We Broke the Siege. Instead of climbing the ladder of official posts in the bad government, or of converting ourselves into a poor copy of our oppressors, our intelligence and our knowledge was turned to the task of growing and building our own strength. This precept, everywhere it is found, operates upon a similar conclusion. When we build structures, they should be built as mimics of the world we wish to create. In doing so, those of us who operate inside of them are changed, and our ethos is reconfigured. This process eases the burden of action, turning our transformative politics into a way of life instead of an exhausting affair. Further, once a structure is built in such a way, it reinforces itself, creating a path of least resistance toward our natural ends. But more than that, the precept of emergence and the inspection of the ideological boundaries of our society can form a practical path forward in transforming both our social relations and the structure of our society. There are some key boundaries, each attendant with a certain kind of emergent behavior, that we must pay heed to. First, in the concept of prefiguration, we must take heed that when we build any structure meant to advance our movement, we remember that we are creating a concept of being for the people that operate inside of it, depending on the way that the structure is built. Flat hierarchies and strict accountability in our organizations are therefore not just moral necessities, but matters of energy conservation. Organizations which are structured top-down are actually limited in their ability to achieve leftist ends. Worse, when these top-down structures are allowed to grow in power for too long, while agitation continues alongside, those structures eventually come to represent a new normalizing force against progress. We must also regard the importance of the individual's own internal conceptions of what can be achieved in society. After all, these collections of individuals form the constituencies of different power structures, either constructing them through their compliance or deconstructing them through their defiance. These individual internal conceptions, summed together in this way, can therefore either represent the driving force of revolutionary impulse or potent opposition to progress if we don't work to change them. But, perhaps most importantly, we must heed the importance of our era. Within each span of time, different feedback cycles exist, both as proactive mechanisms to maintain the existence of prevailing structures and in the opposing cycles built by the misery of the populace from the excesses of those structures. In each era, therefore, we are bid to use the existing feedback cycles in order to bolster the ones that we build, for the purposes of either subverting the cycles which are predicated upon injustice, or constructing the cycles which produce dignity and equity. This is echoed in the words of Marx, who said, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." Thus, in order to escape our era, we are forced to operate first within the framework of the liberal republic. This is why I will not advocate, as many other anarchists do, that we abandon all action within liberal political institutions. These institutions are undeniably in feedback with massive numbers of people, and the concessions that take place within those institutions therefore serve an important purpose in setting the tone of cultural expectations. Indeed, the energy generated by successes in these institutions can create explosions of membership and enthusiasm for leftist movements. I advocate that organizers and thinkers work within electoral systems that they think they can transform most meaningfully, while being constantly vigilant of the effects that the boundaries of those institutions can have upon them. The entryist, for example, having entered an extraordinarily coercive political institution, is very susceptible to having their mindset changed by the boundaries and expectations of their trade instead of subverting them. After enough concessions to these expectations, the entryist can be turned into a systemic component themselves, not a saboteur acting in the interests of the masses. Those who organize for electoral politics are at risk too, as they must be very careful not to become myopic toward the ends of the republic and overallocate resources that would have been spent more effectively on the construction of democratic citizen movements. Because although we have conceded that there is some energy to be gained from the election of politicians into the republic, by themselves, these tactics cannot liberate us. In order to spare these tactics the pitfalls of aimlessness and careerism, we must have separate, principled activist structures that provide counter-leverage on these individuals as they carry out their particular tasks, to constantly shift focus back to their duty as leftists and re-solidify their ideology. Yes, this can split our efforts by placing capable organizers into compromising positions, But we must endeavor to build robust systems separate from the successes of these institutions that will recruit a growing number of people to our movements. After all, if we don't, we will fizzle out regardless. And if we do, we can bear the sacrifice of a few individuals to carry out their chosen task. Also, so long as we are bound to the era of the liberal republic, we are also bound, both by morality and practicality, to seek protections for the oppressed within the existing paradigm. Inside of capitalism, social programs often represent the strengthening of the dignity of the masses and the freedom of individuals from the coercion of the capitalist work or die ethos. Indeed, as we steal power away from the institutions of racism, sexism, genderism, ableism, and all other institutions of oppression, we degrade the ability of those institutions to distract us from the revolutionary task at hand. We must also do what the traditional left has done and build unions. Although we must be aware that the union, as an entity, only continues to exist so long as capitalism exists, and that it is thus reliant upon capitalist property relations. Under socialism, there would be no unions, because every workplace would be subsumed by robust and complete worker control, without separation of the manager from the worker, or the owner of capital from the producer of labor value. Thus, although radical unions have always and always shall be an indispensable ally in the fight for socialism, the union in general should not be confused for something it is not. Unions, like social programs, should be thought of as a temporary respite from the complete domination of capital, while the charade of capitalism is allowed to continue. Although the union can be a fighting unit, it is also an entity which can be domesticated for capital's interests. Altogether, this combination of tactical responses creates a cumulative pressure, both in formal liberal institutions and in the creation of prefigured economic and solidaric structures, shifting the ideological boundaries of the masses. And, to be certain, as the mental expectations of the people change, institutions will not go along with this process without a fight. The impulse to flatten their hierarchies, undermine their ruling ideology, and shift power into citizen structures is wholly contrary to the desires of the powerful. They will therefore exert their own normalizing force, which attempts to reconfigure people's expectations to the previous era. This interplay between the leftward changing attitudes of the populace and the recalcitrant establishment can be seen as two cycles in opposition to one another. So, in order to alter the expectations of the power structure, we must present an opposite force that overwhelms institutional resistance. With every bit of power we attain, we must demand concessions that appear impossible in the current system. Thus, when they seek to compromise with us, they do so from a position that is much further left and much more anti-authoritarian than they ever would have conceded had the demands begun within their existing paradigm. This repeating cycle must be fought for tirelessly, such that we drag those institutions, kicking and screaming, along with us through the expanding Overton window that our radical demands create. As this process takes place, our structures grow stronger, invigorated by success in enacting leverage, while the institutional structures grow weaker in their repeated capitulation to the masses. And, rest assured, the faster we achieve these goals, the more force they will exert to stop the shift. Therefore, throughout this process, we must also aim to erode the coercive ability of those institutions to resist our changes. Otherwise, they may respond with suppressive violence, as history has shown many times. Once individual expectations have been shifted on a mass scale, organizational concepts of being have been prefigured using cooperative structures, and the cycles attendant to the liberal republic have been weaponized against the prevailing power structures, we will have undergone a thorough transformation of society. We then enter into a decline of liberal capitalism and the rise of economic and social democratization. Once this cycle is begun, we are no longer speaking of mere progress. We are speaking of revolution in the style of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. When our ideas on any subject, material, intellectual, or social, undergo a thorough change in consequences of new observations, I call that movement of the mind revolution. If the ideas are simply extended or modified, there is only progress. Here we might say that we use the apparent engine of progress in order to lead to revolution. It is not a complete revolution, in that humanity shall not be fully liberated upon the revolutionary juncture, but it instead represents the fertile soil for the next set of revolutionary cycles. In this view, revolution is not a single event, it is a process. As the systems of dominance representing liberal capitalism fall into disrepair, and the revolution at hand pushes forward their elimination, institutions will give way to dynamic new cycles that will necessitate different responses. As such, different tactics will be necessary as the conditions progress, and we must be expectant of how our approach will have to change in kind when this takes place. Moreover, we should not wait until these organizations will be necessary. We should, instead, endeavor to build them preemptively. These sorts of organizations, prefigured to function in the next paradigm, might appropriately be referred to as revolutionary organizations. Not because they themselves create a revolution, although in a significant way they do, but because they are meant to endure into the world created after our revolution. For example, while we should try to dilute the coercive power of liberal institutions through demilitarization of the police and shrinking of the national military, we should not rely upon this tactic to guarantee our safety. While we are building the prefigured structures that are necessary to shift popular consensus and undermine hierarchical management in liberal institutions, we should also be forming the means to resist future violent suppression through the creation of leftist citizen militias, gun clubs, and information networks. This is not because we seek to use these groups within the era of liberal republicanism, but instead because, as the power of capitalist institutions decline, they will exert a desperate coercion that will almost certainly be violent in nature, and we must be prepared to defend the liberatory project against such an assault. Another example of a possible revolutionary organization is the confederation of a leftist cooperative sector. As the co-ops form networks of trust and distribution, they should also form democratic structures for making decisions among themselves, coordinating their cumulative economic pressure. This represents a sort of formal economic version of the workers' councils and confederations of past revolutionary attempts. Not only will this entity be a central piece in amassing power for the left, it will endure almost identically into the New World. We must maintain and wield the power of these organizations with extreme responsibility, using them only as passive threats, never as bludgeons to create fear. Fear, after all, is the tool of the conservative, not the revolutionary. Our tool must be hope. So, let's review. In our theory of action, we posit the following. All social change is achieved through the creation and maintenance of positive feedback cycles, while also undergoing the prefiguration of social arrangements such that they produce emergent revolutionary behaviors in their adherents. At the same time, we must expect resistance from reactionary forces, both in the populace and in liberal institutions, and do our best to undermine these forces as our cycles build in strength, forming the institutions which will allow us to resist their violence when it inevitably comes. This framework then produces the following actionable principles. 1. We must endeavor in every situation that is available to change the internal mental conceptions of those we come in contact with. 2. We must build structures in all areas of our lives, economic, personal, political, and otherwise, that are mimics of the ones we wish to achieve in the New World. 3. We must alter the existing power structures such that we undermine their hierarchical nature and push them toward capitulation to the prefigured structures that we build in the current world. 4. We must always demand more from existing institutions than we reasonably expect them to concede. knowing that some compromise will always take place when all is said and done. 5. We must prepare ourselves for violent resistance from prevailing institutional structures and reactionaries as they realize that their power dwindles by comparison to leftist agitation and organization. The application of these principles may not always be easy or straightforward, but we must think in a complex way if we wish to overwhelm a complex system of subjugation. And in following these principles, because we have not met the violence of hierarchy with another violent hierarchy, we do not risk undermining the movement that we've built. There is an intoxicating simplicity in demands such as insurrection now or general strike now. But such declarations fundamentally misunderstand the processes that lead to a successful insurrection, were we to desire one, and the underlying organizational work that has to be done to even achieve a general strike. Correctly identifying the goal of liberation, but misunderstanding the path to achieving it, these solutions ultimately then just represent distress and aimlessness, products of anachronistic thinking, which fundamentally misunderstand the strength and development of our organizations and the content of our historical era. Humanity's liberation will not be had through some single act of liberatory violence or spontaneous labor solidarity. We're going to have to suffer for this better world for our entire lives, building its structures brick by brick, spreading its ideological foundations to everyone who will listen. Progress and solidarity will happen over the course of years of protracted struggle, with escalating but never completely transformational moments of glory and reprieve. We are here, inside the belly of an imperialist beast that has grown to titanic proportions. Its crushing weight has left a long trail of destruction and destabilization across the globe, viewing even its own citizens as empty machines, plunging them into cycles of misery and alienation, then blaming them for the predicament it has created. It is contingent upon us to use every moral avenue available to prevent this monstrosity from demolishing the delicate and interconnected web of life that underpins our natural existence. We do not have time for more false starts, for more movements pretending they will be the next vanguard while the world burns. We do not have time for more fantasies of violent emancipation. The work that stands in front of us requires methodical, empathic, educated action, which serves to dismantle the prevailing structures and construct the organizations that will replace them now. If it seems like the collapse is too fast approaching and that our time is too short, then know that it is far past time we get to work. There is a long road ahead, and the longer that is spent on the project of perpetual deconstruction and its aimlessness and distress is a delay on the process at hand. It is time that we begin the construction of the new world, while there is still time to build it. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you want to help spread the work I'm doing here, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Tell me what kind of content you want to see. Also, if you want to help me eat and pay the bills, become a patron at the Patreon link below. Anyway, see you around. And remember, if we wish to see liberation, we must live liberation.